It was supposed to be a routine afternoon. The sky hung heavy with gray clouds rolling in from the west, whispering threats of rain as cars pushed through the traffic, horns blaring in frustration and impatience. On the corner of a busy intersection, life moved like clockwork. People going about their day, unaware of how quickly one moment could change everything. Among those people was Colonel Michelle Anderson, a high-ranking U.S. Army officer dressed casually in jeans and a plain green blouse, her uniform jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat beside her. To the world, she looked like any other black woman trying to make it home in time to feed her dog and finish her paperwork. But inside that quiet calm, she carried the weight of over 2 decades of service and discipline, of sacrifice and leadership. Michelle had just left a Veterans Outreach Center where she volunteered once a week. Her shift had run a little longer than usual. There was a young soldier going through something serious, and she wasn't the kind to walk away until a fellow comrade was steady on their feet. As she merged into the flow of traffic, her mind was still with him. That's probably why she didn't immediately notice the squad car pulling behind her, its lights flashing. She blinked and glanced at her rearview mirror, confusion washing over her face. She hadn't been speeding. Her signal was on, everything seemed in order. Still, she slowly pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down her window as the officer approached. From the moment he stepped out of his cruiser, there was tension in the air. Officer Dale Monroe, a patrolman with 4 years on the force, walked toward her with a kind of tightness in his shoulders, a suspicion already written on his face. It was the kind of suspicion Michelle had seen far too often. She didn't speak right away, just kept both hands on the steering wheel, calm and practiced, knowing how important that small detail could be. But Dale wasn't looking for calm. His instincts, warped from years of bad training and unchecked bias, flared at the sight of her. A black woman, alone, driving a nice car. He asked for her license and registration with a sharpness in his voice that didn't match the situation. She gave it to him without hesitation, but the questions that followed weren't standard. They felt invasive, aggressive. He wanted to know where she was coming from, where she was going, why her plates didn't match his expectations. She answered, everything with a quiet patience, hoping logic would cut through his attitude. It didn't. His tone grew harder, his hand never leaving his holster. Back at dispatch, nothing flagged. Her name was clean, no warrants, no issues. But Officer Monroe wasn't convinced. He asked her to step out of the car. Michelle hesitated. Just a second. She wasn't afraid. She was calculating, wondering if she should reveal who she was, pull rank, let him know exactly who he was dealing with. But she'd done that before. She'd seen how some men reacted when they realized they'd tried to bully someone more powerful than them. So, she stayed quiet and complied. Slowly opening the door, she stepped out with her hands still visible, her voice calm, firm. That's when everything went wrong. In a flash, Dale claimed she was reaching for something. A command barked, a shuffle of feet, and then a gunshot. The sound cracked through the street like a whip. A woman nearby screamed. Michelle dropped to the ground not because the bullet hit her, thank God it hadn't, but because she had learned in combat zones to reduce her profile in danger. The shot had grazed her shoulder, enough to send blood trickling through her blouse, pain pulsing under the skin, but not enough to stop her from yelling, "I'm a U.S. Army colonel! You shot me!" It was too late. The damage was done. Bystanders gathered in horror, some pulling out phones, recording what had just unfolded. One woman called 911. Another screamed at the officer. She didn't do anything. Dale stood frozen, his weapon still drawn, his expression shifting from authority to panic as her words registered. Army colonel. The words hit like a brick wall. He'd just shot a decorated military officer at a traffic stop, for no reason. And yet this was only the beginning of the chaos. Across town, in a city bus heading in the opposite direction, 17-year-old Jamal Brown was adjusting the strap of his backpack, keeping his eyes low as he usually did. Jamal was the kind of teen who didn't like to draw attention. He had been taught by his mother, by his uncles, by the world, that the quieter you moved, the safer you were. But today something was different. The bus was crowded, and a visibly pregnant white woman stepped in, looking exhausted and flushed. Nobody moved. Most people pretended not to see her. Jamal noticed. And despite the weariness in his bones from working part-time after school, he stood and offered her his seat with a shy smile. She looked at him, surprised, almost confused, but then grateful. She lowered herself gently and said, "Thank you. Young man, not many people would do that." Jamal just nodded. No big deal. But something lingered in her expression. She kept glancing back at him during the ride, like she was seeing something in him that even he didn't recognize. As the bus neared her stop, she fumbled in her purse and handed him a small folded note. "Read this when you're alone," she whispered, stepping off the bus. Jamal watched her disappear into the crowd. The note sat in his pocket like a weight. He didn't open it right away. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he thought it would just be a thank you. He had no idea that what was written inside would change the direction of his entire life. Back on the roadside, Colonel Michelle was being treated by paramedics. Her wound wasn't life-threatening, but it wasn't just the physical pain that had her shaking. It was the betrayal. The shame of bleeding in uniform without having drawn a weapon. The humiliation of being treated like a criminal by someone who swore an oath to protect. The media got wind of the story within the hour. Nightfall. The video had gone viral. A high-ranking black woman shot by a white officer during a traffic stop, despite following every rule. The headlines exploded. Debates erupted. Protests formed. And somewhere quietly a woman who had seen Jamal's kindness on a bus had lit a spark that was about to spread through everything. Because inside that folded note wasn't just a thank you. It was an invitation, a door to something bigger, something that connected Jamal to Michelle, to justice, to a purpose he never thought he'd be part of. But neither of them knew that yet, not Michelle, who was still trying to process how quickly her status and uniform had meant nothing. Not Jamal, who was walking home with a backpack full of books and a note that would unlock a truth buried deep in the past. And not Officer Monroe, who would soon learn that shooting a U.S. Army colonel didn't just end in paperwork. It ended in the unraveling of a career, a department, and a system that had been broken far too long. Because this story wasn't about one bullet. It was about what happens after. What happens when quiet people rise, and what happens when one seat offered in kindness becomes the first step toward a storm no one saw coming. And as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the streets, that storm was already on its way. Michelle sat in the back of the ambulance, the sterile smell of antiseptic stinging her nose as the paramedic applied pressure to her shoulder. Her mind wasn't on the pain. It was spinning in circles, going back through every second of that. Stop. She'd done everything right, her hands visible, her tone calm, her answers clear. Yet still, it had ended with a gun being fired. Her blood on the pavement. All those years serving her country. Afghanistan, Iraq, leading operations, training young soldiers to make decisions under pressure. And yet, here on U.S. soil, a routine traffic stop had nearly ended her life. The paramedic gave her a sympathetic glance but didn't say much. She could feel the weight in his silence. He'd probably seen it before. Or maybe he was just struggling to process what kind of person she really was. Her rank, her record. All of it reduced to nothing in the eyes of someone who saw only the color of her skin. Across the street, Officer Monroe stood stiffly beside his patrol car, his mouth tight, his hands clenched. His supervisor had arrived and was speaking to him in hushed tones, trying to keep the situation from spiraling out of control. But it was too late. Cameras were rolling, witnesses were talking, and every second that passed, more truth spilled. To the world. Truth they wouldn't be able to cover up. Michelle's ID had finally been verified, her title confirmed. The colonel, the service medals, the commendations. She wasn't just any civilian. She was the embodiment of discipline and loyalty to the nation, and she had been treated like a threat. Still, she remained quiet, even as the news vans pulled up, even as her commanding officer called to make sure she was stable. She didn't want revenge, she wanted answers. Why did he see her as danger? What had gone so wrong in his training, or in his heart, that he thought drawing his weapon was the first solution? And even deeper than that, why did part of her already know this would happen, long before the siren lights appeared in her rear view? The crowd outside was growing. Protest signs were already being scribbled onto cardboard. Cell phones captured it all, including the quiet tears rolling down the cheek of a teenage girl who had watched her hero, a woman she once saw speak at a school event, bleed on the sidewalk. This wasn't just another news story. This was personal. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, Jamal sat on his bed in the small apartment he shared with his mom and little sister. The room was quiet, except for the hum of traffic outside and the occasional creak of the building settling. The folded note the woman had given him sat untouched on his desk. Something about it made his chest feel tight. He didn't know why. It wasn't like he hadn't gotten thank you notes before. His principal had once written one when he helped calm down a kid having a panic attack. But this felt different. His mom, Tanya, peeked in from the hallway. "You good?" she asked, her eyes tired but always gentle. "Yeah, just thinking," Jamal replied. "You eat yet?" He nodded, even though he hadn't. She smiled faintly and left the room. He could hear her settling into the living room, probably watching the news like she always did after work. That's when he heard her gasp. "Jamal, come here." He got up quickly, his heart already thudding. She never called like that unless it was serious. He walked into the living room, and there on the TV was a breaking news alert. The image of a black woman being loaded into an ambulance filled the screen, the headline bold beneath it. Army. Colonel shot during traffic stop by police officer. Investigation underway. Jamal stared, feeling a wave of nausea rise in his stomach. That's her, isn't it?" he whispered, recognizing the woman from a Veterans Day event at his school, Colonel Michelle. She'd spoken to his class about honor, courage, discipline, everything his father used to talk about before he passed. His mom looked at him, her face a mix of pain and anger. "That's her. That's the one who gave a speech last year, remember? Said something about serving with your head held high." Jamal couldn't breathe for a second. That same woman had been stopped and shot. He walked back to his room slowly. The world around him suddenly quieter, heavier. His fingers trembled as he reached for the note. He unfolded it carefully, the paper creased and soft from where he'd clutched it earlier. Inside was just a few lines, handwritten in elegant cursive. "If you ever need help, show this to any member of the Hartwell Foundation. You showed me kindness today. Let me return it. You're exactly the kind of young man we need." Below the message was a phone number, and beneath that, a name. Rebecca Hartwell. Jamal stared at it, confused. He didn't know the name, but something in his gut told him it was important. Pulled out his phone and did a quick search. His eyes widened. Rebecca Hartwell wasn't just some regular woman. She was the founder of a major nonprofit organization that supported military families, veterans, and underserved youth. Her foundation had influence, reach, and power. He reread the note again, trying to figure out why she'd chosen him, why she'd taken the time to write this, to hand it to him like it was something sacred, and how all of this was somehow tied together. The colonel, the traffic stop, the woman on the bus, the note. Couldn't be coincidence. Back in the hospital, Michelle lay on a narrow bed under the dull hospital lights, refusing to sleep. Her phone buzzed with messages, fellow officers, generals, even journalists trying to get a statement. But she remained silent. Not out of fear, but strategy. There would be a time to speak, but first she needed to understand what this was really about. She knew the system well enough to know that when something like this happened, someone always tried to bury it, spin the narrative. She wasn't going to let that happen. What she didn't yet know was that someone had already started pulling at the threads of that cover-up. A young boy who'd just offered a seat, a woman who saw potential, and a note that was far more than just a thank you. Outside the hospital, protesters chanted in the growing night, their voices bouncing off buildings and mixing with the sirens in the distance. Justice for Colonel Anderson, Justice for all the ones whose names never made the news. And somewhere in that noise, in that rising tide of truth, a quiet storm was forming. Because this wasn't just a story about a traffic stop gone wrong. It was about who we choose to see and who we choose to believe, and what happens when the wrong person is underestimated for the very last time. By the next morning, Michelle's face was everywhere. News anchors tried to keep their tone neutral, but the footage spoke louder than any headline. People weren't just shocked, they were furious. She was a symbol now, a mirror to a much bigger problem, and everyone had an opinion. Some defended Officer Monroe, saying he feared for his life. Others asked the obvious. How could a trained soldier, unarmed and cooperative, be seen as a threat? Michelle hadn't given interviews yet, but her silence only stirred more interest. Whispers of legal action floated around. Civil rights lawyers had started reaching out. Even the Department of Defense issued a cautious statement saying they were monitoring the situation closely, but Michelle didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to breathe again without flinching. She sat in her hospital bed with her phone turned off, her uniform jacket folded neatly on the chair beside her. She kept thinking about the faces of the young soldiers she trained, black, white, brown men and women, who looked up to her. She had taught them to stay calm under fire, to show restraint, to lead with honor. And now she had to figure out how to do that herself, not on a battlefield, but in front of cameras and courtrooms. In another part of the city, Jamal sat in the back of his English class, half listening to the teacher drone on about Shakespeare. His mind wasn't in the room. It kept drifting back to the note, to the name, to the image of Colonel Anderson bleeding on the ground. He hadn't told anyone about the note yet. Not his mom, not his best friend Marcus. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was instinct. But something told him to hold on to it a little longer. During lunch, he sat under a tree near the edge of the school grounds, away from the noise. He opened his phone again and scrolled through articles. About Rebecca Hartwell, there were dozens. Photos of her shaking hands with presidents, speaking at military events, launching education programs for underserved youth. She wasn't just rich, she was powerful, and she clearly cared about people like him. He dialed the number on the note, but hung up before it rang. Twice. The third time he let it go through. "Hello?" came a smooth, warm voice on the other end. Hi. My name's Jamal Brown. You probably don't know me. I met someone on the bus. She gave me a note. She said to call this number if I ever needed help. There was a short pause. "You're the young man who gave up your seat for me," the woman said gently. Jamal's eyes widened. "That was you? I didn't want to distract you then, but yes. I'm Rebecca Hartwell, and I'm very glad you called." He didn't know what to say. I didn't know who you were. I try to stay quiet about it when I'm out in the world," she said. "Kindness means more when it's offered without conditions." There was a beat of silence. Then she added, "I assume you've seen the news?" Jamal nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "That's the woman from the stop. Colonel Anderson. I saw her speak once at school." Rebecca's voice turned thoughtful. "She's a good friend, one of the best people I know." Jamal felt his stomach twist. Why would someone shoot her? "That's the question everyone's asking," she said, "but not everyone's ready for the answer." He didn't know what she meant by that, but he could feel it. There was more going on here than just one bad officer making a mistake. "Would you be willing to meet me, Jamal?" she asked. "There's something I'd like to talk to you about, and someone I think you should meet." Jamal hesitated. "Okay. Where?" She gave him an address. "Downtown, her foundation's main office. I'll send a car for you tomorrow after school." As he hung up, Jamal felt the pressure building in his chest. This wasn't just about kindness anymore. Something bigger was pulling him in, and he wasn't sure if he was ready. Back at the police precinct, Officer Monroe sat alone in an internal affairs room. No badge, no gun, just a cold cup of coffee and a thick stack of paperwork. His hands were shaking, not from guilt, but fear. He'd been through rough stops before, sure, but this was different. Shooting a colonel? The media made it sound like he'd gunned down a national treasure. The union rep sitting beside him kept whispering that things would be fine, that they'd spin it, that she moved too fast, that she resisted. But Monroe wasn't sure anymore. He hadn't expected her to be military. He hadn't expected her to be calm. He hadn't expected anything, really. That was the problem. He just acted on instinct. Training or not, fear took over. And now everything was unraveling. His supervisor was under pressure. The mayor wanted statements. Civil rights organizations were planning a march that weekend, and the department's reputation, already shaky, was now sitting on a powder keg. What Monroe didn't know was that someone had started digging into his past. An independent journalist, Maya Linton, had found a pattern in his stops, disproportionately targeting black drivers. Excessive force reports, all quietly settled. But this time, it was out in the open, and Maya smelled a story that could tear down more than just one officer. It could bring down an entire precinct's cover-up culture. She pressed print on a file of documents she'd just received anonymously. Body cam footage, internal memos, even a sealed complaint from a woman who'd been stopped by Monroe just 6 months ago. It all pointed in one direction. This wasn't an accident, it was a pattern. And the truth, once lit, was impossible to put out. At the hospital, Michelle stared out the window, her shoulder still aching. A knock came at the door. She turned to see a nurse holding a phone. "There's a Rebecca Hartwell asking to speak with you," the nurse said. Michelle took the phone, already knowing what this meant. "He called you?" she asked. "Yes," Rebecca replied. "He's smart and cautious." "He'll need to be," Michelle said quietly. Rebecca hesitated. "Do you think he's ready?" Michelle closed her eyes. "No, but neither were we when we were called. The question is, will he stand when it matters?" And outside, the city kept moving, its people unaware that beneath the surface of a traffic stop, a quiet war for truth was already in motion.